Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a really fundamental question in American government. The tricky balance of power between states and the federal government, especially when it comes to something as big and, well, contentious as immigration. Our mission for this deep dive, we're going to unpack the legal arguments, the philosophy behind Arizona v. United States. It was a huge Supreme Court decision back in 2012. We'll look at why Arizona passed its own pretty sweeping immigration law, SB 1070, how the Supreme Court reacted, and importantly, the very different views from inside the court itself. This isn't just dry legal stuff. It really shows how these big constitutional ideas affect actual policies and, people's lives.
Absolutely. And what's so interesting is that this case, Arizona, it's not just about immigration policy per se. It's really a deep look at American federalism itself, that constant dance between state power, state sovereignty, and the authority of the federal government. We'll explore not just what the court decided, but why it still matters so much today.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It all starts back in 2010 in Arizona. They passed this law, officially the Support Our Law Enforcement and Safe Neighborhoods Act, but everyone just called it SB 1070. What was really driving Arizona to pass such a major piece of state legislation on immigration?
Well, the sources are pretty clear. Arizona explicitly designed SB 1070 to, and I'm quoting loosely here, discourage and deter the unlawful entry and presence of non-citizens, and also to curb economic activity by people who were undocumented. It was framed very much as a response to what they saw as a serious detrimental effect on the safety and well-being of Arizona's legal residents because of the number of undocumented immigrants there.
So it sounds like Arizona basically felt, look, the federal government isn't handling this, so we have to step in. Is that a fair summary?
That seems to be the core motivation, yes. A perception of federal inaction, or at least insufficient action, leading the state to feel it needed to fill that void.
But that move immediately caused a huge uproar, didn't it? Concerns about racial profiling, constitutionality.
Oh, absolutely. Fierce division. It sparked massive protests, lots of legal challenges almost immediately, and that really teed up the central legal question. Ultimately, who is in charge of immigration policy in the U.S.?
Right, that fundamental question for how our system works. Who should control immigration?
Exactly, because historically, the federal government has always had really broad authority here, almost exclusive, you could argue. But states, they're the ones feeling the day-to-day impacts, right? Socially, economically, on public safety resources. So sometimes they push back. They want their own solutions. And that tension, that's exactly what landed Arizona v. United States at the Supreme Court.
So we're looking at a real clash of powers here. You've got the state's general power to make laws for health and safety, their police power.
Yeah.
But then you have the federal government's specific constitutional powers over things like foreign affairs, naturalization.
Precisely. Especially that uniform rule of naturalization clause in the Constitution, giving Congress power over citizenship.
Right.
And crucially, the supremacy clause, which basically says valid federal laws trump conflicting state laws. That becomes really central here.
Okay, so the Supreme Court takes the case, 2012. And they largely sided with the federal government, right? Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion. What was his main line of reasoning?
Kennedy really hammered home the idea of the federal government's broad, undoubted power over the subject of immigration. That was a key phrase. And he laid out this critical principle called preemption. He said, when Congress occupies an entire field, even complementary state regulation is impermissible.
Wow. So it's not just that state law can't contradict federal law. If Congress has legislated comprehensively enough, states can't even add to it in that area.
Exactly. It's like the federal government has claimed that whole policy space. Even if the state thinks its law helps the federal goals, if Congress's plan is meant to be the only plan, the state law is out. It's preempted.
So based on that preemption idea, the court struck down most of SB 1070. Can you walk us through the specific parts that got invalidated?
Sure. There were 3 key sections they struck down. First was Section 3. This made it a state crime for an unauthorized immigrant to even look for work or to work. Kennedy said, nope, federal law already has a whole system for regulating alien employment, think I-9 forms, employer sanctions. So this state law interferes, preempted.
Okay, so Section 3 was out because federal law already covered employment. What else?
Then there was Section 5C. This part required non-citizens to carry their federal registration papers like a green card at all times and made it a state crime if they didn't. Again, Kennedy said the federal government already has a detailed system for alien registration. Federal law decides who needs papers and what the penalties are. Arizona couldn't add its own layer, so preempted again.
Right. Makes sense. Interfering with the federal scheme. And the third one?
That was Section 6. This allowed Arizona police officers to arrest someone without a warrant if they had probable cause to believe that person had committed any public offense that made them removable from the U.S. The court found this gave state officers too much power in what's fundamentally a federal domain deciding who gets deported. It could lead to inconsistent enforcement and bypass the federal government's priorities and procedures. So Section 6 was preempted too.
Okay, so three major parts of the law: struck down employment, carrying papers, and state-based arrests for removability. But you mentioned one part did survive, Section 2B. What was different there?
Yes, Section 2B was the interesting exception. This required state officers, importantly, after making a lawful stop or arrest for some other reason like a traffic violation, to make a reasonable attempt, when practical, to determine the person's immigration status if there was reasonable suspicion they were undocumented.
So was it creating a new reason to stop someone?
Exactly. Kennedy reasoned that this wasn't preempted because it didn't give state police new powers to detain people just based on suspected status. It was more about checking status during an encounter that was already legal for other reasons. He saw it as potentially cooperating with federal law, not interfering with it, though he did add cautions about potential harassment or improper implementation.
That's a subtle but important distinction: cooperation versus interference. But not everyone on the court agreed with this overall approach, right?
Right.
Justice Scalia had a very different take in his dissent.
Oh, completely different. Scalia was a strong defender of state sovereignty. His dissent really championed that view. He started by emphasizing that the U.S. is a union of sovereign states, and he believes states have an inherent power to exclude people from their territory. A fundamental power, in his view.
So he disagreed that the federal power over naturalization automatically meant exclusive power over all immigration control.
Precisely. He argued the power to set rules for becoming a citizen didn't wipe out the state's power to control who physically enters or remains within their borders, especially when it impacted the state directly.
And he seemed to think Arizona was justified because the federal government wasn't doing its job.
Yes, that was a huge part of his argument. He was quite blunt, actually. He called federal enforcement of immigration laws a miserable failure. His point was, states shouldn't just have to sit there and suffer the consequences, social, economic, of what he saw as federal inaction or failure. Therefore, he argued, states must have the power to legislate to protect themselves. He would have upheld Sections 3, 5C, and 6, seeing them as valid exercises of Arizona's sovereign authority.
Wow, miserable failure. That's strong language. It really highlights that fundamental disagreement. When a state feels the federal government has dropped the ball, how much power does the state retain to act on its own?
Exactly. Scalia's dissent brings that tension right to the surface. This wasn't just about interpreting statutes. It was about defining the very nature of the relationship between the states and the federal government, especially on sensitive issues like border control.
So connecting this back to the bigger picture, Arizona v. United States wasn't the end of the story, was it? How did this ruling, this debate, influence things going forward?
Well, it definitely underscored those ongoing tensions. The ruling clearly reinforced the federal government's top position on immigration policy, but it also showed that states still feel the need to act when they perceive federal policy as lacking or harmful to their interests. The key takeaway from the ruling itself is that while states have concerns, their actions generally have to fit within the federal framework, not challenge or replace it. Section 2, surviving, shows there's some room for state cooperation, but the lines are drawn primarily by federal law.
And we've seen other attempts to deal with immigration since then, often reflecting these same underlying issues, right?
Absolutely. Think about things like the DREAM Act proposals in Congress over the years, trying to find a federal solution for undocumented immigrants who came as children. Or President Obama's DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, created by executive action in 2012, actually the same year as the Arizona decision. These were federal-level responses addressing some of the very populations and pressures that states like Arizona were reacting to. It shows the debate continuing. Who acts? How? And who has the final say? It highlights the complexity and the different philosophies at play.
So quite a journey we've taken through Arizona v. United States. We've really unpacked how the Supreme Court wrestled with that constitutional tightrope act between federal power and states' rights in the immigration context. We saw Justice Kennedy focusing on that comprehensive federal authority and the idea of preemption.
And then Justice Scalia's powerful defense of inherent state sovereignty, especially when, in his view, federal efforts fell short.
The case ultimately cemented the federal government's lead role in immigration.
But it did leave that little window open with Section 2B, showing states can sometimes cooperate within the federal system. It really demonstrates how legal interpretation keeps evolving as it confronts these really complex real-world problems.
And all this leaves us, and you, with a really interesting question to think about. When you consider all the complexities of immigration, the different impacts on states versus the national interest, where do you think that balance of power should ultimately lie? What could finding that balance, or perhaps not finding it, mean for the future of federalism right here in America?